The Pope's answer, when it finally arrived, ran 2 sentences and the grammar was broken. December 963. Around 50 bishops sat in council at St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, along with cardinals, deacons, Roman nobles, and the Emperor Otto I, who had just conquered most of Italy. They had gathered to put a pope on trial, and a messenger had carried his written reply down from the hills. In the usual English rendering it runs, "To all the bishops, we hear that you wish to make another pope. If you do, I excommunicate you by Almighty God, and you have no power to ordain no one or celebrate Mass." Maybe you caught the problem. No power to ordain no one. A double negative sitting in the official correspondence of the Vicar of Christ. The bishops caught it instantly, and their reply contains one of the driest jokes ever entered into the record of a church council. They informed His Holiness that, as far as they had always understood grammar, 2 negatives make an affirmative, so by his own sentence he had just confirmed their power to do exactly the thing he was threatening them over. Then they added that his Latin was about what you would expect from a slow schoolboy, and they invited him for the 2nd time to come to Rome and clear his name. He never came. The man who wrote that letter was up in the hills near Tivoli with a good chunk of the papal treasury loaded onto pack animals, and when messengers went out to serve him the 2nd summons, they came back empty-handed. Nobody could find him. He was out hunting. His name was John XII. He was somewhere around 26 years old. He had been Prince of Rome since roughly 16, Pope since roughly 18, and by the time that letter reached St. Peter's, the sworn testimony stacked up against him included selling bishoprics for cash, consecrating a 10-year-old boy as a bishop, ordaining a deacon in a horse stable, blinding his own confessor, castrating a cardinal who then died of it, sleeping with his dead father's mistress, handing chalices from St. Peter's altar to his girlfriends, turning the Lateran Palace into something the witnesses flatly called a brothel, drinking a toast to the devil, and calling on Jupiter and Venus for luck while he threw dice. Within 3 months of that letter, he would ride back into Rome, take a blade and a whip to the men who had deposed him, and hold a counter-council to undo everything. Within 6 months, he would be dead at about 27, in bed with a married woman, and one chronicler swears the devil himself struck him on the temple as he went. Almost everything vivid in that list comes from men who wanted him remembered exactly that way, and I'll point them out as we go. In this story, who is talking matters as much as what gets said. But even the records with no axe to grind can't find much nice to say about him. So that's who we're spending tonight with. The teenager who inherited the throne of St. Peter the way other boys inherit a farm. Before we get properly into it, welcome back. And if you're new here, settle in. This is a long one. Drop a comment, letting me know where in the world you're listening from. I go through those more than I probably should. And a genuine thank you to the Patreon supporters and the YouTube members who keep this channel alive. You make these videos possible. If you'd like to join them, all the links to support the channel are down in the description and in the pinned comment. Right. 10th century Rome. Start with the city that produced him. The Rome he was born into around 937 barely deserves the name. 8 centuries earlier, over 1 million people had lived inside those walls. By John's childhood, the guesses run to maybe 20 or 30,000. The Aurelian walls still stood, 12 miles of them, but the city inside had shriveled down to a few inhabited clusters along the Tiber, and the rest was empty. Romans had a word for it later, the disabitato, the uninhabited part, and it made up most of the space inside the walls. Vineyards grew over the Palatine, where emperors once lived. Cattle grazed in the Forum. Later centuries would name it the Campo Vaccino, the cow field. The great aqueducts had been cut during sieges centuries before and never fully repaired, so the population huddled near the river and drank from it, floods, sewage, corpses and all. Malaria came off the marshes every summer and killed with a regularity nobody questioned anymore. Ancient temples stood roofless with trees growing out of the upper courses. Marble came off imperial monuments and went into lime kilns to make mortar, so the city was quite literally burning its own past for building material. At night, wolves were sometimes heard inside the walls. This is the capital of Western Christendom we're talking about. The city every soul in Europe dreamed of seeing before death, and they still came. That's one of the strangest things about this period. The pilgrims never stopped. They walked from England, from Francia, from Germany, down the Via Francigena, months on foot through forests full of bandits, over alpine passes that killed people every season, to pray at the tomb of St. Peter and touch the threshold of the apostles. They arrived at a wreck of a city run by aristocratic clans who fought each other with knives in the streets, and they knelt anyway, because underneath St. Peter's high altar lay the bones of the fisherman himself, and no ruin on earth could cancel what that meant. Those pilgrims stay in this story, and the women among them come back into it later in the ugliest possible way. The road they took has a paper trail of its own. An Archbishop of Canterbury from just after our period wrote down his route home, and it ran to 79 overnight stops, 79 days of walking, minimum, one direction, through the Alps and the fever plains of Tuscany, past shrines where earlier pilgrims who hadn't made it were buried by the roadside. The ones who survived the journey arrived at St. Peter's and found whole foreign neighborhoods waiting, the Scolae, national compounds where Saxons and Franks and Lombards and Frisians each kept hostels for their own. The English quarter sat so close under the basilica that its name, the Burg, still lives in the Roman district called the Borgo. And every one of those travellers, rich or destitute, left something at the tomb. Coins, silver, candles, land deeds from kings, a lifetime's savings from a farmer's widow. Centuries of it, piling up in the treasury of the Roman Church. That treasury has its own part in this story. A young man is going to load it onto mules one autumn night and ride it into the hills, and some of what jingled in those packs was the offering of a woman who had walked 79 days to give it. The Pope in this era ruled the city in theory. In practice, the papacy had become a prize that a handful of Roman noble families passed around, fought over, and occasionally murdered for. 40 years before John's birth, In that same Lateran complex where he would later grow up, a scene had played out with a strong claim to being the low point in the entire 2,000-year history of the papacy, and the boy was raised in its long shadow. January 897. Pope Stephen VI orders the body of his predecessor, Pope Formosus, dug out of its tomb. Formosus has been dead about 9 months. What comes out of the ground is what you'd expect after 9 months. A partially decomposed corpse, skin gone leathery and black where it hasn't sloughed away, the smell filling the room the moment the wrappings open. Stephen has this thing dressed in full papal vestments. The silk goes on over the rot. The corpse is carried into the council hall and propped upright on a throne, and then Pope Stephen puts it on trial. This actually happened. It's in multiple sources. It's one of the most securely documented events of the century, and contemporaries were as horrified as you are. They called it the Synod of the Corpse. A trembling deacon was appointed to stand beside the dead man and answer on his behalf, while Stephen screamed the charges at the body, that Formosus had violated canon law, that he'd held his office unlawfully, that he'd perjured himself. Whenever the corpse was invited to respond, the deacon would answer in a small voice for it. The verdict, you will be shocked to hear, was guilty. Formosus was declared to have never validly been pope. His acts were annulled. Then the punishment. The vestments were stripped off the body, and the 3 fingers of the right hand, the fingers a pope uses to give blessings, were hacked off. The corpse was dragged through the streets of Rome and thrown into the Tiber. A monk fished the body out downstream and hid it, and the story went around that when Formosus was eventually reburied, the images of the saints in the church bowed to him. Rome, meanwhile, turned on Stephen within months. He was seized, stripped of his own vestments, thrown into a cell, and strangled there in the summer of 897. The corpse trial is the weather report for the world John XII was born into. In the 30 years after the corpse trial, the papacy changed hands about a dozen times. One pope reigned 20 days. Popes were imprisoned and murdered with almost administrative regularity. One smothered, another strangled, others left to starve in cells. The office that claimed authority over every Christian soul on earth had become a knife fight between Roman families, and out of that knife fight, one family emerged holding everything, John's family. Their story runs through 2 women, a mother and a daughter, and what got written about those 2 women is the reason this whole era of papal history carries the nickname it does. Church historians politely call it the Saeculum Obscurum, the Dark Century. The less polite name, coined later by Protestant writers with a point to make, is the pornocracy, the rule of the harlots. And whatever you make of that label, and it tells you at least as much about the men who invented it as about the women it targets. The family behind it is the direct explanation for how a teenager ended up on the throne of St. Peter. Around the year 904, a Roman aristocrat named Theophylact maneuvered himself into control of the city. He held the titles that mattered: commander of the militia, master of the treasury, and he backed the election of a pope named Sergius III, a man who owed him everything and behaved accordingly. Sergius, incidentally, is the same pope who had cheered on the corpse trial years earlier as a young cleric, and later, once he had the throne, he had two rival claimants strangled in prison. That was his qualification for the papacy. Theophylact liked him fine. Theophylact's wife was named Theodora, and by every account she was the sharper political operator of the two. Our main chronicler for this whole family, a bishop named Liutprand of Cremona, and you'll be hearing that name constantly tonight, described Theodora as a shameless whore who wielded power over the Roman citizenry like a man. Notice what's doing the work in that sentence. Her crime, in his telling, is competence in the wrong body. Liutprand wrote decades later, from the court of a German emperor, about Roman women he despised, so his adjectives come preloaded. But nobody, then or now, disputes the underlying fact. Theodora ran things. Then comes the daughter, Marozia, born around 890, and by the time she was about 15, she was the mistress of Pope Sergius III, a man roughly 30 years older than her, the sitting pope, an ally and dependent of her own father. Whether you want to call a 15-year-old handed to a middle-aged pontiff by her parents a mistress or something darker, I'll let you sit with. The sources treat it as an arrangement, the way you'd record a land transaction. Out of it, so the story goes, came a son, a boy named John, fathered by the Pope himself. Liutprand states it flatly. Other records are quieter about the paternity, and some historians think the boy's father was actually Marozia's first husband. Either way, Rome will later watch that child-crowned pope while his mother stands behind the throne. Marozia's first husband, on paper, was a warlord named Alberic of Spoleto, a rough soldier who'd carved out power in central Italy. With him she had another son, also named Alberic, and that second boy is the father of tonight's subject. So the family tree, such as it is. Theodora and Theophylact at the top, Marozia their daughter, and beneath her two sons by two different men, possibly three men if you count the Pope, and eventually a grandson who is our John XII. Edward Gibbon, writing in the 1700s, looked at this genealogy and produced a sentence historians still quote with a kind of appalled admiration. The bastard son, two grandsons, two great-grandsons, and one great-great-grandson of Marozia, a rare genealogy, he says, were seated in the chair of St. Peter. One woman's descendants, occupying the papacy for the better part of a century and a half. Marozia's rise was not gentle. In 928 she moved against the reigning Pope, John X, a capable man who had personally worn armor at the battle that finally cleared Saracen raiders out of central Italy. He was too independent for her taste, and he had a brother, Peter, who was his right hand. Marozia's faction stormed the Lateran. They cut Peter down inside the palace in front of the Pope, his brother butchered before his eyes in his own home. John X himself was dragged to Castel Sant'Angelo, the fortress tomb of the Emperor Hadrian that the family used as their citadel, and locked in a cell. He was dead within the year. Liutprand passes on the version whispered in Rome, a pillow held over the old man's face until he stopped moving. However exactly it was done, everyone understood whose order it was. 2 short papacies followed, men who conveniently died, and then in 931, Marozia produced her masterpiece. She had her son John, the one fathered by reputation by Pope Sergius, elected Pope as John XI. He was in his early 20s. His qualifications were his mother. Rome now had a pontiff whose father may have been a pontiff, installed by a woman who had allegedly murdered a previous pontiff. And if your head is spinning, the Romans' heads were spinning too. This is the atmosphere our subject was born into a few years later. This was normal to him. This was the family business. Marozia had one more move in her, and it destroyed her. Widowed twice by now, she arranged a 3rd marriage to Hugh of Provence, the King of Italy, the most powerful man in the peninsula. One obstacle: Hugh's late brother had been her 2nd husband, and canon law counted that as incest. Hugh's solution was to declare publicly that his brothers were bastards and no true kin of his, thereby making his dead brother a stranger and his marriage clean. He slandered his own mother's name to clear a path to the wedding bed. Such was the man now entering this story. The wedding took place in 932 inside Castel Sant'Angelo, a marriage celebrated in a mausoleum which several later writers found appropriate. And at the banquet, one of those tiny moments happened that ends up rerouting the history of an institution. Marozia's teenage son Alberic, from her first marriage, was serving at table as noble boys did. He brought the water for the king to wash his hands, and he did it clumsily, spilled it, or held the basin wrong. The accounts differ. Hugh struck him across the face. In front of the assembled guests, the King of Italy hit his new stepson like a servant. Alberic walked out of that banquet, went straight into the streets of Rome, and razed the city. The speech attributed to him boils down to this: the dignity of Rome has fallen so far that we now take orders from a Burgundian, Hugh's people, foreigners, and once this man is settled here with his soldiers, you will all be slaves. Rome, a city that hated outside rule the way it hated nothing else, rose overnight. A mob stormed Castel Sant'Angelo. Hugh, King of Italy, went over the wall on a rope in the dark and abandoned his bride of a few weeks to her fate, running for his army camped outside. He never got her back. He never really got Rome back either. And Marozia's fate is one of the coldest details in this whole saga. Her own son took the fortress, and he took her. She was arrested, and she disappears. The record simply stops carrying her. The most powerful woman in Italy drops out of it from 932 onward, and the near certainty is that Alberic kept his mother locked in a cell, possibly in that same fortress, for the rest of her life. One much later notice suggests she may have lived on in confinement for over 50 years, into her 90s, an old woman forgotten in the dark while her grandson rose and fell above her until someone was finally sent to absolve her shortly before she died. The source for that is late and shaky, and I give it to you as a story that circulated rather than a certainty. But nobody ever saw her free again. Her son made sure of it. Alberic's half-brother, Pope John XI, got a version of the same treatment. Alberic left him on the throne. A pope in the family was useful, while stripping him of every scrap of independence, and kept him, in the words that come down to us, practically as a household servant, a chaplain who performed sacraments when told to and otherwise stayed quiet. The Pope of Rome, fetching and carrying spiritually for his younger brother. He lasted a few more years like that and died in the mid-930s, still in his 20s. Nobody suggests foul play. Nobody needed to. So take stock of the young man now running Rome, because his character presses directly onto everything his son becomes. Alberic II, at roughly 18 years old, has overthrown a king, imprisoned his own mother for life, and reduced his own brother, the Pope, to a servant. And here's the twist that nobody sees coming. He then governs well, genuinely well, by the standards of the age. For 22 years, from 932 to 954, Alberic rules Rome with the title Prince and Senator of all the Romans, and he gives the city something it hasn't had in living memory: stability. He beats back Hugh's repeated sieges. He reforms the currency. He invites Odo of Cluny, the most respected monastic reformer alive, into Rome to clean up the monasteries, and the two men work together closely. At one point, Odo even brokers a peace under which Alberic marries Hugh's daughter Alda, his enemy's child, to seal a truce. Alberic is ruthless. He is a usurper. He keeps the papacy in a cage, but under him the murders stop, the mobs quiet down, and Rome functions. The cage itself is the machine his son inherits. During those 22 years, 4 popes reign, and every one of them is Alberic's appointment and Alberic's subordinate. Leo VII, a monk who kept to spiritual matters. Stephen VIII, about whom a grim later tradition survives. He apparently crossed the prince somehow, and the Chronicle says he was mutilated, disfigured so badly he could no longer show himself in public. A pope hidden away because of what had been done to his face. The detail comes from a later source and floats a little loose from the contemporary record, but it fits the operating logic of the regime well enough that historians repeat it with a wince. Then Marinus II, who reportedly wouldn't so much as act without the prince's instruction. Then Agapetus II, a decent and respected man who held the office while understanding precisely how much of it he actually held. That's the world. Now the boy. Octavian was born somewhere in the window between 930 and 937 in the family's palace on the Via Lata, the old triumphal road running through the heart of inhabited Rome. Even his birth comes with a question mark attached, and it's not a trivial one, since it decides whether he became pope at 17 or in his mid-20s. The respectable version makes his mother Alda, Hugh's daughter, the peace treaty bride, married to Alberic in 936, putting the boy's birth in 937 and making him legitimate. But a Roman monk called Benedict, writing up on Mount Soracte north of the city within living memory of these events, recorded in his lumpy, half-broken Latin that the prince fathered his heir on a concubine. If Benedict has it right, Octavian arrives earlier, around 930, and the future pope is illegitimate, a bastard, in an era that cared about the term, destined for the most legitimate office on earth. The Chronicle's grammar is genuinely bad enough that scholars argue about what the sentence even says. I love that, in a bleak way. The man's whole life is a fight over the sources, starting with the day he was born. The name, at least, tells you something solid. Alberic named his son Octavian. He passed over the saints' names and the family names, and reached straight for the birth name of Augustus, the first Roman emperor. A prince of a ruined city, naming his heir after the man who built the marble version of it. The ambition in that choice isn't subtle. This boy was being pointed at empire from the cradle. What he wasn't pointed at, apparently, was books. The same monk Benedict, who lived close enough to know, laments the boy's education. And everything in the later record backs him up. The Pope, whose Latin got laughed at by a church council, was not a young man who'd been kept at his lessons. He was raised as a soldier prince, horses, hawks, hounds, weapons, the aristocratic curriculum of the 10th century. Somewhere along the way, his father also had him tonsured and installed as Cardinal Deacon of Santa Maria in Domnica, one of the old deaconry churches on the Caelian Hill. In this household, that title was a coat hook. Alberic was holding a place for his son inside the church, and in 954, dying, he executed the plan the place had been held for. Alberic was only around 40, and we don't know what was killing him. The sources just show him failing. What they do show, in some detail, is what he did about the succession. He had himself brought to St. Peter's, and he summoned the Roman nobility and the senior clergy to gather around him at the Confessio, the shrine directly over the tomb of the apostle. And there, above Peter's bones, he made every man present swear an oath. At the next vacancy of the Holy See, they would elect his son Octavian Pope. Papal elections were, by canon and ancient custom, supposed to be free. The clergy and people of Rome choosing under the guidance of the Holy Spirit. Alberic, from his deathbed, converted the next election into an inheritance, and he made Rome's elite swear it on the most sacred spot in Western Christendom. The oath itself was arguably sacrilege, sworn on the one tomb that made Rome matter. Nobody refused him. You didn't refuse Alberic, even a dying Alberic. And the deeper move is easy to miss. For 22 years he had kept the Principate and the papacy strictly separate, himself over here holding the power, a tame pope over there holding the holiness. For his son he fused them. One boy would hold both. Whether that was dynastic genius or a father's blindness to what his son actually was, you can judge as we go. Alberic died in August 954, and Octavian, in his mid to late teens, stepped into the princedom without a ripple. Rome obeyed him because Rome had spent 2 decades obeying his father. Then, on the 8th of November, 955, old Pope Agapetus died, and the oath came due. The electors kept it. On the 16th of December 955, Octavian was consecrated Bishop of Rome in St. Peter's. If the later birth date is right, he was 17 or 18 years old, quite possibly the youngest pope in the entire history of the office. His only serious rival for that title comes 80 years later, and I'll ruin the surprise now. It's another member of this same family. They made a habit of this. One of his first acts as Pope was, oddly enough, one of his most influential. And it's the one thing he did that every single one of his successors still imitates. He changed his name. Octavian, he seems to have felt, or his advisors felt, was a bit much for the throne of the fisherman. Too pagan, too imperial, or maybe just too much his father's ambitions stamped on his forehead. So he took the name John, becoming John XII. Only one pope had ever done this before. 4 centuries earlier, in 533, a Roman priest unfortunately named Mercurius, after the god Mercury, decided a pope probably shouldn't carry a pagan god's name and became John II. Octavian made it too. After him, the practice caught on, and within a few generations it hardened into the tradition we still watch on the balcony today. Every Francis, every Benedict, every John Paul is following a precedent set by, of all people, this man. For a while, his chancery even ran both identities in parallel. Some documents signed John, others still issued as Octavian, Pope with one hand, Prince with the other, and the paperwork itself couldn't quite decide which he was. That split is the whole story of the reign, honestly. Rome now had a single ruler wearing 2 men. As prince, he was expected to hunt, feast, command troops, and carry on his father's court. As pope, he was expected to sing the offices, celebrate the stational masses, judge the clergy of the world, and live, at least publicly, like a successor of the apostles. He was a teenager. Guess which half won? First, a word on where the next stretch of material comes from. This is the part of the video the title promised you. The detailed picture of John's private life comes overwhelmingly from one document. The record of the council that tried him in 963, written up by Liutprand of Cremona. Liutprand was an Italian bishop in the service of Otto, the German king. The man who convened the trial, deposed John, and needed Christendom to accept that deposing a pope was justified. Liutprand is also, separately, one of the most entertaining and most venomous writers of the entire Middle Ages. One of his other books is literally titled Revenge. So every lurid item you're about to hear arrives through a hostile pen, recording testimony given by Roman clergy who had just switched sides and had every incentive to bury the man. That's the health warning. Against it stands this: the charges were made publicly, in front of 50 bishops and the assembled Roman elite, by named witnesses swearing oaths about events in living memory in their own city. And no source from John's own camp survives to answer them, while the neutralish chronicles, the thin ones, mutter in the same general direction. What you do with that is up to you. My job tonight is to tell you what they said. They said the Lateran had become a brothel. That's the word the testimony uses. That the sacred palace, the residence of the popes since Constantine, the building containing the basilica ranked first among all churches on earth, was operating as a whorehouse under its 19-year-old bishop. Women came and went from the papal apartments. Some were paid, some were prizes. The witnesses at the synod, when they got to the sexual charges, made a distinction that I find weirdly convincing in its caution. They admitted they had not seen these things with their own eyes, but said they knew them with certainty. The 10th century equivalent of everybody in this building knows, and then they got specific. with names. Stephana, they said, his father's concubine, the dead prince's own mistress, taken into the son's bed. Rome had a long memory for classical precedent, and this one had a whiff of the old emperors about it, the bad ones. Then Rhaenyra, a widow, and with her the charge grows a second head, because the testimony adds that John didn't just carry on with her, he paid her out of the church. He put golden chalices from St. Peter's into her hands, sacred vessels from the apostles' own altar, and he granted her control of cities from the papal lands, actual towns with actual inhabitants, signed over to a mistress like a tavern tip. Then a widow named Anna, and then the item the council clearly found hardest to say out loud, Anna's niece, his own kinswoman by some tellings, folding incest into the pile. Adultery, sacrilege, and incest, all in a single paragraph of testimony, delivered in St. Peter's with the emperor listening. Then the pilgrims, the same men and women walking months across Europe to pray at Peter's tomb. The accusation that circulated, and Gibbon later fixed it in one of the most quoted sentences ever written about the papacy, was that John's appetites had made the holiest shrine in the West unsafe for women. That female pilgrims, wives and widows and virgins who had crossed the Alps on foot, were being warned away from St. Peter's itself, for fear the Pope would take them. Gibbon's phrasing runs that his rapes of virgins and widows had deterred the female pilgrims from visiting the tomb of St. Peter, lest in the devout act they should be violated by his successor. By Peter's successor, in Peter's house. However much of that is Roman gossip inflated by enemies and polished by an 18th century stylist, the idea alone, the shrine of the apostle as a place mothers warned their daughters about, tells you what his own city was prepared to believe of him. And that reputation was built at home before a single German bishop got involved. The women were only one shelf of the catalogue. The gambling charges have a texture all their own because they come with a soundtrack. Plenty of clergy gambled and confessed it, and dice alone would scarcely have made the record. The charge was that when John rolled them, he called out for luck to Jupiter, to Venus, and to other demons. That's the synod's word, demons, because to a 10th century churchman the old gods hadn't stopped existing. They had just been correctly identified as devils. The vicar of Christ in his own palace, invoking the patron gods of pagan Rome over a game. And his birth name was Octavian, a young man named for Augustus, calling on Augustus's gods, in the city Augustus built. Even his blasphemy had a classical education his Latin lacked. Gibbon, ever dry, remarked that the invocation, if true, could hardly have been serious, and maybe it was a joke at the dice table, a teenager being edgy for his drinking companions. But it was the Pope being edgy, and someone in the room remembered it for years and eventually swore to it in front of an emperor. Alongside that sits the toast. Witnesses, and here the record says everyone present, clergy and laity together, affirmed this one, declared that John had drunk wine to the love of the devil, a raised cup in the Lateran to Satan's health. Add the smaller liturgical charges, and a picture assembles. He celebrated Mass at improper hours, or skipped communion within it. He never made the sign of the cross. He ignored matins and the canonical hours, allegedly because the hours in question found him either asleep or occupied. The office of Pope has a rhythm of prayer at its core, 7 times a day, the heartbeat of the job. The testimony describes a palace where that heartbeat had simply stopped, and something else was pulsing instead. Out of doors, they charged him with living openly as what he was, a hunting aristocrat. He rode out with hawks and hounds, publicly, which sounds harmless until you remember canon law flat-out barred clergy from the hunt. And he wasn't a country archdeacon bending a rule. He was the visible head of the church, demonstrating daily that the rules were furniture. They said he girded on a sword. They said he put on a helmet and a cuirass, that he armed and armored himself like the soldier his father raised him to be. A Roman crowd was going to see exactly that with their own eyes soon enough, on the walls of the city, and even his enemies would have to describe it with a certain stunned respect. Then the church as marketplace material. Simony, the selling of holy things, was the sin the reformers of the next century would build their whole movement around, and the witnesses at John's trial described it as his standard operating procedure. Ordinations for cash, bishoprics priced and sold. One witness, a cardinal deacon named Benedict, testified with others that John had consecrated a 10-year-old boy as Bishop of Todi, a real diocese in Umbria with real souls in it, handed to a child, presumably a child whose family paid well, though the testimony never records the price. And John of Narni, a bishop, together with a cardinal deacon also named John, swore they had personally watched the Pope ordain a deacon in a horse stable. Among the animals, in the straw and the dung, outside the appointed times, the sacrament conferred like a bet settled at the races. Whatever that scene actually was, a drunken lark, a calculated insult, an emergency nobody explained. 2 senior churchmen stood up under oath and said, "We saw it." The catalogue turns physical from here. The witnesses charged John with blinding Benedict, his spiritual father, his confessor, the man appointed to hear the Pope's sins and guide his soul, likely a man who had known him from childhood. We aren't told what Benedict did. Rebuked him once too often is the guess that writes itself. Blinding in this world was a deliberate craft with a known toolkit, red-hot iron drawn across the open eyes, or the blade, or thumbs, held down by however many men it took. It was the punishment emperors used on rivals precisely to leave them alive, but finished. Benedict, the testimony says, did not stay alive. He died from what was done to him, from the shock, the wound fever, the sepsis that followed the iron. His penitent killed him by inches, starting with the eyes. Then the cardinal subdeacon, John, yes, another John. The 10th century had about 4 names to go around. The charge, the Pope had him castrated, and he died of it. Castration outside a battlefield was a message, a punishment tradition reserved for sexual offenders, so the choice of mutilation was itself a statement. Whatever this subdeacon had done or was accused of doing, or whoever he had done it with, someone decided that this specifically was the part of him that had offended. Under 10th century conditions, That meant held down, cut with whatever edge was at hand, and then the bleeding, and no version of medicine standing between him and the grave beyond a hot iron and a bandage. The record gives him one line: castrated and died. A cardinal of the Roman Church, and his entire ending fits in 4 words. Arson rounds it out. Fires set, the testimony says, without telling us what burned or who was inside. In a city built of dry timber packed between ruins, where a fire in one block ate the neighborhood, tossing that charge onto the pile almost casually says something about how long the pile already was. Murder, perjury, sacrilege, simony, incest. The summarized indictment ran through the whole grim list, and this against a man in his mid-20s, describing a reign of about 8 years. If even a third of it is true, the Lateran of the 950s was one of the darkest addresses in Europe. If almost none of it is true, then 50 bishops and the better part of Rome's clergy stood in St. Peter's and perjured themselves in unison over the tomb of the apostle. Neither option is comfortable. Pick your horror. While all of that was allegedly going on indoors, the actual job, ruling the Papal States, was going badly, and this is where the politics start rolling downhill toward the trial. Give him this much: John did not hide from the political half of the inheritance. Around 958 or 959, still barely into his 20s, he personally took an army south against the Lombard princes of Capua and Benevento, trying to claw back territories the papacy claimed. The campaign collapsed. The man on the other side, Pandulf of Capua, history remembers him as Pandulf Ironhead, and you don't earn a name like Ironhead by losing to teenagers, outfought him, and John came home with nothing but the bill. His father had spent 22 years never losing control of anything. The son's first solo venture ended in retreat, and Italy noticed. The vultures noticed most. Up north sat Berengar II, who wore the title King of Italy, and his son Adalbert, and the pair of them ran their kingdom like a protection racket with a crown on it. With the Pope revealed as beatable, Berengar's forces pushed into papal territory and started taking it. Towns and strongholds inside the lands John was sworn to protect peeled away while he could do precisely nothing about it. The Prince of Rome, son of Alberic, was being carved up in his own front garden by a second-rate king every chronicler of the era despises. So John reached for the biggest weapon on the board, and in doing so, he set every remaining event of his life in motion. In 960, he sent an embassy north, across the Alps, to the court of Otto of Saxony, king of the Germans. Note the 2 men he chose to carry the appeal, because this story has a savage sense of structure, and both of them will be back. A cardinal deacon named John, and a senior papal notary named Adzo. Their message, dressed in the proper formulas, came down to a plea: for the love of God and of the holy apostles Peter and Paul, come to Italy, deliver the Roman Church from the tyrant Berengar, and restore what has been taken. And along with the plea went the one thing a pope could offer that no one else on earth could: a crown. The imperial title of the West, vacant for decades, waiting in Rome for a man strong enough to hold it. John was inviting the most powerful ruler in Europe to come and take it from his hands. Otto said yes. Of course he said yes. He had been building toward exactly this his entire reign. And to understand the scale of what John had just invited into Italy, you need about 2 minutes on who this man was. Otto was about 50, roughly twice John's age, and he had spent his whole adult life doing the opposite of everything John stood accused of. King of the Germans since 936, he had crushed rebellion after rebellion, including ones led by his own brothers and his own son, and forgiven just enough of the rebels to look magnanimous while burying the rest. In 955, on the plain of the Lechfeld outside Augsburg, he had met the Magyar horsemen, the raiders out of Hungary who had terrorized Europe for 2 generations, the ones whose approach emptied whole valleys, and he had annihilated them so completely that the raids stopped for good. The survivors were hunted through the rivers and marshes for days, and the captured chieftains were hanged. Western Europe's most feared enemy simply stopped existing as a threat in one afternoon, and men began calling Otto what they had once called Charlemagne, the Great. He was pious in the heavy, organized, church-building way of serious medieval kings. He was patient, and he wanted one thing his sword hadn't yet given him. Emperors were made in Rome by popes at the tomb of Peter. Only John could make him one. So consider the transaction from both ends, because both men thought they were using the other. John gets a rescuer, a hammer to drop on Berengar, and, he assumes, a protector who will collect his crown and go home over the mountains like Charlemagne's heirs used to. Otto gets the title that turns a German king into the successor of the Caesars, from the hands of a compromised boy he expects to manage. One of them has badly misjudged the other, and it takes about a year to find out who. Otto came over the Alps in 961 with an army that ended the campaign before it started. Berengar declined battle altogether, scattered his strength into mountain fortresses, and hid. And before Otto approached Rome, oaths went ahead of him. He swore to defend the Pope, to protect the Roman Church, to restore its lost territories, and to make no decree in Rome touching the Pope or the Romans without John's consent. Everything correct, everything sealed. On the 31st of January, 962, Otto entered Rome, and 2 days later, on the 2nd of February, Candlemas, when the churches glowed with blessed candles, John crowned him. The scene in St. Peter's that morning is one to linger over. At the altar over the apostles' bones stands a pope in his mid-20s, and before him kneels a 50-year-old Saxon warlord, and the young man anoints him with holy oil and sets the imperial crown on his head, and on his wife Adelaide's beside him, and by that gesture the Holy Roman Empire comes into being, the institution that will sit at the center of European politics for 844 years, until Napoleon finally kills it in 1806. Voltaire's joke that it was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire came much later. On that February morning it was all three, and the man conjuring it into existence was our John, quite possibly the least holy Roman in the building. One detail from that day cuts through everything, and I think about it a lot. A story preserved in the German records has Otto, before entering the basilica, turning quietly to his sword-bearer, a young noble named Ansfrid, with an instruction. "While I kneel today at the tomb of the apostles to pray, hold the sword above my head the whole time. I know only too well what my predecessors have found trustworthy in these Romans." a man about to receive the crown of the West from the Pope's own hands, arranging armed cover for the moment his eyes would be closed. Such was the emperor's trust in his new spiritual father on the happiest day of their alliance. Otto bowed in prayer, and above his bent neck, a drawn blade watching the room. The day around that blade was, by every account, magnificent. Rome could still stage magnificence when it wanted to, even amid the ruins. Processions wound from the city gates to the basilica, through streets hung with whatever finery the churches could produce, the clergy chanting the laudes, the old ritual acclamations naming the new emperor alongside Christ and Peter in the same breath of song. Romans packed the route to watch a Saxon take the crown of the Caesars from the hands of Alberic's son, and whatever they privately made of it, the sound carried. For John himself, this was the summit, a 24-year-old presiding over the single most consequential ceremony Europe had staged in a century and a half, personally speaking the words that turned a king into an emperor. Nothing else he ever did in a church came close, and every event that followed in his life happened under this day's consequences. The honeymoon lasted 11 days and produced 2 documents. On the 12th of February, a synod in Rome, Pope and Emperor side by side, established the new archbishopric of Magdeburg out east, Otto's pet project, a missionary hub aimed at the Slavic lands, along with a new bishopric at Mersburg, plus pallium grants for Otto's favoured archbishops. John signing off on Otto's blueprint for the German church, cooperative as could be. And on the 13th of February came the big one, the Diploma Ottonianum, drawn up in gold letters on purple-dyed parchment, in which the new emperor confirmed to Peter and his successors basically everything popes had ever claimed: the city, the duchies, the patrimonies, the donations of the Frankish kings, territories Otto didn't even control yet, all guaranteed. Generosity, wall to wall. And then, down in the operative clauses, the hook. Henceforth, papal elections would proceed canonically, but the man elected could not be consecrated until he had sworn before imperial representatives an oath of loyalty to the emperor. One sentence, and the papacy had an overlord. The boy who inherited the office as family property had just signed the family property over to a landlord. Whether John grasped that at the time, or whether it was explained to him afterward by someone with better Latin, the sources don't say. His behavior over the next year suggests it dawned on him fast and hit hard. One small marvel attaches to that document. It still exists, and you don't have to take anyone's word about it. A luxury copy of the Ottonianum, produced at the time, gold script on parchment stained imperial purple, survives in the Vatican's own archives, 1100 years old, the actual physical instrument of the papacy's subordination, preserved for a millennium by the institution it subordinated. Of all the objects that touched John XII's life, that sheet is nearly the only one you could still stand in front of. Otto marched out on the 14th of February to go dig Berengar out of his rocks, and Liutprand notes that on the way out the emperor sent his young spiritual father some parting advice, urging him to leave off the hunting and the women and the rest, and to live as his office demanded. A middle-aged conqueror telling the Pope of Rome to clean his room in effect. John's response to being fathered by his own protector was about what you'd expect from a prince of his upbringing. He waited until Otto's back was turned, and he betrayed him. Look at it from inside John's skull for a second, though, since his logic isn't hard to trace. He had invited Otto in to remove Berengar. He now watched Otto swallowing Italy whole, the fortresses falling one by one, the emperor everywhere obeyed, an imperial oath now legally wrapped around the throat of every future pope, meaning his own successors, meaning the family business. His grandfather's generation had risen exactly one way, playing bigger powers off each other and letting no single one settle in. From where John sat, Otto had stopped being the solution and become the biggest threat the family had ever faced. So the Pope started writing letters. Letters to Adalbert, Berengar's son. The heir of the tyrant John had begged Otto to destroy, proposing, in essence, an alliance against the emperor. Letters east, to the Magyars, inviting them to come at Otto from Hungary. The Magyars, the people Otto had butchered on the Lechfeld 7 years earlier, whose destruction was the foundation of his fame. The Pope of Rome was asking them to try again, to open a second front of pagan raiders against the most Christian emperor for his convenience. And letters to Constantinople, to the Byzantine court, feeling out the other empire's interest in cutting the new one down. Envoys carried all this quietly through an Italy crawling with imperial patrols, and you can guess the rest. Otto's men caught the couriers. The letters, seals and all went straight to the emperor's tent. Otto's reaction is one of my favorite lines of the whole century. Confronted with documentary proof that the Pope who had crowned him was soliciting pagans against him, the emperor shrugged more or less and said, as Liutprand tells it, he's a boy who may yet be changed by the example of good men. That was the whole reaction. A middle-aged man filing the Pope of Rome under adolescent, to be corrected later. Otto sent envoys down to Rome to look into things, and the reports they brought back were the full menu we've already been through. The women in the palace, the vessels of Peter handed out as gifts, the whole inventory, now flowing directly into the imperial court's records, and hardening from gossip into case file. John, for his part, sent his own smooth ambassadors to Otto with reassurances, and among them, in a twist nobody in the room could have called, was the papal official, who would end up wearing the tiara within the year. Everyone was lying to everyone, and the boy was lying worst and lying least well. Then John stopped pretending. Adalbert, hunted, half-beaten, the son of the tyrant, sailed out of hiding, came to Rome, and the Pope received him, publicly. The two of them, the teenage pontiff and the fugitive prince, standing together on the wall's side of an open break with the emperor. When word reached Otto, the file closed. He left a holding force at the siege of Berengar's last fortress and turned the main army toward Rome, late summer of 963. And here we get the scene that even John's worst enemy had to write down, the one I flagged earlier. As the imperial army approached the city, the defense of Rome was commanded in person from the fortifications by the Pope, in a helmet and a cuirass, with a great sword, moving along the ramparts among the fighting men. Liutprand records it with a sneer about how well the armor suited him, but the sneer can't quite smother the image. Alberic's son at last, doing the one thing his whole upbringing had actually trained him for. For a moment the resistance even held. The Romans threw back an imperial probe at the river crossings. It couldn't last, and John knew his own city well enough to know it. Roman resolve was a market. Otto could outbid him, and the moment the first noble families started calculating, the walls were worth nothing. So the Pope made his decision, and it tells you everything about his priorities. He gathered up what remained of the treasury of the Roman Church, the portable centuries of it, the gold, the offerings of all those pilgrims, loaded it, and slipped out of Rome with Adalbert up into the hills toward Tivoli. The shepherd, as one later writer put it, fleeing with the flock's money. Rome opened to Otto without a fight on the 2nd of November, 963. The clergy and nobles came out to submit, and the emperor made them swear a new oath on the spot, and its terms were the whole future in one sentence. Never again would they elect or consecrate a pope without the consent of the emperor and his son. Rome swore. Rome, at that point, would have sworn anything. And with the city secured, Otto did something no emperor had ever done in 9 centuries of Christian history. He convened a council to sit in judgment on the Pope of Rome. The synod opened on the 6th of November 963 in St. Peter's itself, deliberately in St. Peter's, over the bones, so that nobody could later claim the thing was done in some hole-and-corner way. The roll call alone announces how seriously Otto built this. Around 50 bishops, Italian and German together, the archbishops of Milan and Ravenna, the great sees of Lombardy and the Romagna, Otto's own men from Hamburg and Speyer and the rest, alongside the cardinal priests and cardinal deacons of Rome, John's own senior clergy, the men who had lived with his reign at close range. Behind them, the Roman nobility and representatives of the city's militia and its people, and presiding over it all, the emperor, 10 months crowned, sitting in judgment in the church where he'd knelt for his anointing while a sword hung over his head. His caution that morning was looking better every week. One staging detail changes how you hear everything else. Otto couldn't really run the proceedings in his own voice because his Latin wasn't up to public speech. He addressed the council in Saxon, and his interpreter, standing beside the imperial seat and rendering the emperor's words into Latin for the assembled fathers, was Liutprand of Cremona. The author of our record was also the mouth of the prosecution. When you strip it down like that, the whole trial funnels through one brilliant, spiteful man, translating his patron in real time and then writing up the minutes for posterity. Historians have been arguing about that arrangement ever since, and they should. It's also, for better or worse, the best documented event of the 10th century in Rome. Both things are true at once, and neither cancels the other. Otto opened by asking, reasonably enough, why the Pope wasn't present at a council of his own church, and the assembly's answer set the tone, surprised that the question even needed asking, followed by the flood. Then the testimony came, witness by named witness, and the record preserves who stood up for what, so you can watch the indictment assemble in real time. Peter, a cardinal priest, rose and testified that he had seen the Pope celebrate Mass without taking communion, the celebrant himself refusing the sacrament he was confecting, a detail with a genuinely eerie implication if you let it sit, since it hints at a man who believed in it enough to be afraid of it. John, Bishop of Narni, and John the Cardinal Deacon testified to the ordination in the stable and swore they had watched it happen. Benedict the Cardinal Deacon, with fellow clergy alongside, testified to the ordinations sold for money and to the 10-year-old Bishop of Todi. Then came the sexual charges with their careful preface, not seen with our own eyes but known for certain, and the names went into the record one after another. The widow of Rainier, Stephana, his father's concubine, the widow Anna and Anna's niece, and the declaration that the sacred palace had been made a brothel, the hunting in public. Benedict, his spiritual father, blinded and dead of it. John the Cardinal Subdeacon, castrated and dead of it. The fires, the sword, the helmet, the cuirass. And at the end, on the toast to the devil and the dice prayers to Jupiter and Venus, the record notes that everyone, all present, clergy and laymen together, one voice, affirmed it. Otto, through Liutprand's mouth, then did something shrewd. He warned the assembly about slander, reminded them that it's common enough for men in high station to be accused falsely by their enemies, and charged them not to bring anything they couldn't stand behind. In answer, the whole synod swore an oath that if they were lying about the Lord Pope, then might they be struck with the fate of Judas, damned with the traitor for eternity. 50 bishops and the elite of Rome, calling down Judas's damnation on their own heads in Peter's Basilica. You can view that as 50 men absolutely certain of their testimony, or as 50 men who had watched an emperor take their city and knew what was expected in that room. The oath itself sits there in the record either way, doing whichever work you assign it. The council then drafted its first letter to John, and the tone is almost gentle. Everything laid out, everything charged, and a promise attached. Come to Rome under formal safe conduct and answer, and if you can clear yourself, clear yourself. This was the letter that found him in the hills. And back down from Tivoli came the reply we opened this whole video with. The excommunication of everybody, the power to ordain no one and no one, the Pope's Latin collapsing under him mid-threat. Now you know everything that letter was answering. The full sworn catalogue it waved away in 2 sentences. The bishop's response, the 2 negatives joke, the schoolboy jab, went back up the road along with a second sterner summons on the 22nd of November. Appear, or the sentence falls on you instead. And this time the messengers physically could not deliver it, because His Holiness had gone hunting. Follow those riders for a moment, since the record lets us, out the eastern gates, 20-odd miles up the Via Tiburtina, the ancient road climbing toward Tivoli, where the river Anio comes crashing off the hills in waterfalls the Romans had admired for 1,000 years. Below the town sprawled the shell of Hadrian's villa, an emperor's private paradise of domes and pools, stripped and sinking into the olive groves, and somewhere in that landscape of dead imperial luxury, a young man named for Augustus was flying hawks, while a council of the Universal Church waited on his answer. The messengers asked after him at the gates and on the roads, carried their unopened summons around the hills for days, and eventually turned their horses back toward Rome with the citation still sealed in a saddlebag. The Pope of Rome, under formal citation by a council of the Universal Church, with an emperor waiting in his cathedral city, was somewhere in the Sabine Hills with a bow. As a piece of image management, it was suicide. As a piece of characterization, no novelist would dare. On the 4th of December, the synod reconvened, counted its 2 summonses against the canonical 3, decided that a man who couldn't be located was a man who had answered, and moved to sentence. Otto rose, through his interpreter, and recited the case. A pope charged by his own clergy with sacrilege, simony, perjury, murder, adultery, and incest, who had allied with the enemies he'd invited the emperor to crush, who had fled his see with its treasure, and who had responded to a lawful council with insults and disappearance. The assembly's recorded answer is the sentence I'd put on the poster for this whole reign. They begged the emperor to expel from the Holy Roman Church this monster, unredeemed from his vices by any virtue. Monstrum is liud prans Latin, and he chose it with care, a word from the old poets for something born wrong, and to give them a worthy man in his place. So the deed was done. A council of the church, under an emperor's eye, deposed the reigning successor of Peter in his own basilica. Whether any power on earth could lawfully do such a thing was a question canon lawyers would fight about for centuries, and John himself was about to make devastating practical use of the doubt. But on that December afternoon, doubt kept quiet. Then came the replacement, and with it Otto's one unforced error of the whole affair. The emperor proposed, and the synod accepted by acclamation, a Roman named Leo, the proto-scriniarius, the chief notary of the papal administration, essentially the head of the civil service. A respected man, a serious man, and a complete layman. No orders at all. What followed had never been seen. In the span of about a day, Leo was run through every clerical grade in sequence: doorkeeper, lector, exorcist, acolyte, subdeacon, deacon, priest. Steps meant to be climbed over years of formation, taken at a sprint between sessions, and then consecrated Bishop of Rome as Leo VIII. Canon law required intervals between orders, precisely so that no strong man could manufacture a bishop overnight, and here was an emperor manufacturing a pope overnight in front of witnesses. Every enemy of the new regime now had a legal argument shrink-wrapped and ready. The deposition was invalid, the ordination was invalid, the man in white was a notary in costume. John, hunting in the hills with the treasury, had just been handed his counterattack by the very council that condemned him. Rome delivered the rest of it. Whatever the city's elite had sworn in November, the actual population of Rome discovered fairly quickly that it did not enjoy watching a German choose the Bishop of Rome, and John's money, the pack animal loads from Tivoli, was moving through the city buying friends. On the 3rd of January 964, Rome rose. Fighting broke out in the streets against the imperial garrison. Barricades and ambushes, the old city's oldest reflex, and it went the way street fighting against Otto's professionals was always going to go. The legions of the Lechfeld turned the rising into a massacre, and the sources say a great number of Romans died in a single day, cut down in the alleys between the ruins, their bodies the only lasting result of the attempt. Otto had the city's blood up and hostages in hand, and here Leo VIII made the request that defines him, for whatever it's worth. He begged the emperor to show mercy, and Otto, indulging his new pope, released the hostages and stayed his hand. Then, in mid-January, the emperor made his own miscalculation. Adalbert was still loose. Berengar's last fortress had finally fallen. There was a war to finish elsewhere, and Rome seemed cowed. Otto marched the army out of the city to go hunt Adalbert down, leaving Leo behind with a modest force and the sworn word of the Romans. The sworn word of the Romans. John was back inside the walls within weeks. Liutprand, seething, explains the restoration with two forces, the Pope's gold and the women of Rome, his claim being that John's many mistresses and their families formed an actual political faction and agitated the city for him, that the boy was, in the most literal sense, loved back onto his throne. Money made a wall-switching argument too, no doubt. However, the coalition assembled. In February 964, the gates opened for him, and Leo VIII ran for his life. Out of the city, north up the roads to the emperor, barely ahead of the mob, a pope of 10 weeks standing fleeing the sea he'd been sprinted into. John XII walked back into the Lateran that his great-grandmother's faction had once stormed, sat back down on the throne his father had bought him with a deathbed oath, and turned his attention to the men who had testified. What John did over the following days is the part of this story that even the drier chronicles refuse to soften, and the mutilations he ordered were chosen with a logic you can follow limb by limb. 10th century power spoke through the body. You didn't just punish a man, you edited him publicly, so that every person who saw him afterward received the message on sight for the rest of his life. And John, blinder of his confessor, gelder of his subdeacon, by the sworn account, was fluent. Start with the cardinal deacon John. Two histories converged on this one man. He was, in all likelihood, the same Cardinal Deacon John who had carried the Pope's desperate appeal over the Alps to Otto back in 960, the trusted courier of the whole alliance. And he had then stood up in St. Peter's and testified against his master, and served the synod as one of its formal accusers, and put his hand to its acts. The Pope had him seized, and his right hand was cut off, the hand that had carried the letters, the hand that had sworn the oath and signed the record. On a block, with a blade, through skin and tendon and the wrist's small bones, and then the stump seared, hot iron or boiling pitch, the only surgery on offer, so that he would live. Living was the point. A dead man is mourned and forgotten. A one-handed cardinal walks around Rome for 20 years as a proclamation. Adso came next. The papal notary, the other half of that original embassy to Otto, the professional whose entire existence was penmanship, records, the written instruments of the church. The accounts vary on the exact extent, and I'll give it to you as they give it. Some say the hand, others say the fingers of his writing hand, taken joint by joint. Either way, aim it at the meaning. A scribe with no fingers is a man erased from his own profession, sentenced to be helped with his food in public until he dies. He had drafted for the wrong council. Now, whenever documents were signed in his presence, everyone at the table would understand why he only watched. The synod's German members were mostly beyond John's reach, but one wasn't. Otgar, Bishop of Speyer, one of Otto's bishops left behind in the city, was taken and scourged. A consecrated bishop, stripped and flogged like a thief at a whipping post, the lash opening his backstroke after stroke, while Roman onlookers took the lesson. Ecclesiastical law surrounded a bishop's body with penalties for anyone who so much as struck him. John had one whipped raw and dared the world to cite cannons at him. And the chronicle adds one more nameless official to the tally, a man who lost his nose and his tongue and 2 fingers. Weigh that combination. The nose sliced away, leaving the face a flat wound that would mark him among strangers forever. The tongue drawn out with pincers and cut, ending his speech, the tongue, presumably, that had testified. The fingers, the ones that had sworn or signed, face, voice, hand, everything a witness is, removed piece by piece from a living man who was then released into the city to be looked at. Rome had seen atrocity beyond counting, but this was its bishop signing his work. With the object lessons distributed, John moved to paperwork, and here he showed he'd learned exactly the right lesson from his own trial. On the 26th of February, 964, he convened his own synod in St. Peter's. Same basilica, same bones underfoot, mirrored proceedings. 16 bishops and 12 cardinal priests attended, and one figure in the attendance list says everything. 11 of those 16 bishops had sat in the December synod that deposed him. The same men. 10 weeks earlier they had called him a monster unredeemed by any virtue, and invoked the fate of Judas on themselves if they lied. Now they sat under his eye, the smell of Otgar's flogging still in the air, so to speak, and voted to annul every word of it. Whatever else that tells you, it tells you precisely what testimony was worth in 10th century Rome in either direction, and it's the cleanest argument John ever made in his own defense. If fear could produce this synod, fear could have produced the other one. He opened the session himself with a line the record preserves, and coming from him it's almost elegant. You know, beloved brethren, that by the emperor's power I was expelled from my see for 2 months. Then the machinery ran. The December council was condemned root and branch. Leo was declared no pope at all, a perjured intruder, his lightning ordinations void, and he was excommunicated. Sico, the bishop of Ostia who had consecrated him, was stripped of his rank, and the clergy Leo had ordained were reduced to whatever grade they'd held before. 2 popes now existed, each with a synod behind him, each having anathematized the other, one backed by the Emperor of the West, and the other sitting in the actual Lateran. Christendom's lawyers would still be untangling it 1,000 years later, genuinely. The Church's own official lists have flip-flopped on which of these men counts. Otto got the news up north, along with, presumably, descriptions of what remained of Otgar's back and the cardinal deacon's arm, and began preparing to come back and finish it, promising, the phrase that survives is blunt, a harvest. Rome braced. The great families weighed their options one more time. Every road ran toward a second siege, a second sack, worse than the first. And then, in the middle of May, the crisis solved itself in a bedroom. Pope John XII died on the 14th of May, 964, somewhere around 27 years old. And the manner of it, as reported, is the single most notorious papal death ever recorded. Liutprand, who by now you can hear licking the nib, reports that the Pope was outside the walls of Rome, taking his pleasure with a married woman, when in the very act of adultery he was struck. A seizure of some sort is what the account describes. Apoplexy in the old vocabulary, a stroke we'd probably say, his body failing him mid-sin. Later tradition fills in the woman's household, the wife of a Roman named Rhinerius, and Liutprand, of course, cannot leave it at medicine. In his telling, the devil himself dealt the blow, struck John on the temple as he lay there, collected what was owed. The Pope who had toasted Satan's love with wine, the story wants you to understand, got the reply personally. He did not die at once, and that single detail turns this from lurid to genuinely awful, whichever version you favor. He lingered 8 days, paralyzed or broken, in and out of whatever consciousness remained. And in those 8 days, the account is specific, he did not receive the last sacraments. Neither confession, nor absolution, nor the viaticum, the final communion whose very name means provision for the journey. Whether he refused them, as Liutprand implies, or couldn't speak to make a confession, or no priest in Rome would come, or none was sent for, the record just says he died without them. Take that in with 10th century nerves. To this world, dying unconfessed in mortal sin was the worst outcome a human life could have, worse than any death by iron or fire, because those ended and this didn't. Ordinary people structured their whole lives around avoiding exactly this. And here was the man who held the keys, the successor of Peter, the one human being on earth whose office existed to loose sins. Dying 8 days within reach of Rome's 10,000 priests, and going out unabsolved from the bed of another man's wife. His enemies could not have scripted it better, and a number of historians suspect that in a sense they did, that the death itself was ordinary, a young man's stroke or a fever, and the adultery and devil framing was fitted around it afterward, since the sources telling us are precisely his destroyers. The counter-argument writes itself too. Given everything sworn about how this man lived, the reported death is simply the median outcome of a normal week. The record hands you both. It always does, with him. One more version circulated, and it belongs here, since for centuries it was the one people repeated in the streets. In this telling, the medical details drop away and a simpler story stands up. The husband came home. Rhinerius, or whatever his name truly was, found the Pope of Rome in his bed with his wife, and did what a wronged 10th century Roman with strong arms did: beat him, some say with a hammer, some say threw him bodily from the window. And John died of the beating over those same 8 days, his body breaking down around injuries no one dared name in the official account. A pope murdered by a cuckolded husband, and the church drawing a veil by calling it apoplexy. No contemporary source states it outright. It grows in the later retellings, the way the version people find most satisfying usually does. But it survived 1,000 years of retelling for a reason. And the reason is that everyone who ever heard both versions understood that with this particular man, either was entirely possible. They buried him in the Lateran, in his cathedral, St. John's, under the roof of the palace that 50 bishops had called a brothel on the sworn record. He had held the papacy for 8.5 years, and been in that time the maker of an empire that outlived him by nearly 9 centuries, and he was gone before 30 without absolution. And the 2 men he had wronged most, the emperor he betrayed and the anti-pope he unmade, were both still marching toward Rome when the news met them on the road. You'd think Rome, at that point, would take the exit ramp. Otto was coming, his Pope Leo was with him, the man who caused it all was in the ground, and the path of survival was posted in letters 10 feet high. Accept Leo, open the gates, endure. The Romans took one look at that path and elected their own pope instead. 8 days after John died, on the 22nd of May, 964, the clergy and people chose Benedict V, a Roman deacon, and this is where the story picks up a genuinely tragic figure. Benedict was, by every account including his enemies, a good man, learned, upright, so bookish the city nicknamed him Grammaticus, the grammarian. After a decade of John, the Romans reached for his exact opposite, a scholar with a clean reputation. And the reports say Benedict didn't want it. He seems to have understood with perfect clarity what accepting meant, a direct violation of the oath Rome had sworn to Otto, a personal challenge to the most powerful man in the world, on behalf of a city that had already folded twice. They elected him anyway, and swore, with that inexhaustible Roman confidence, that they would defend him against everyone. So the century's worst papacy got, as its immediate sequel, a decent man pushed onto a burning throne by his own neighbors. Otto arrived in June, made no assault at all, and simply locked the city up to let hunger do the work, and his men stripped the countryside around Rome so there'd be nothing to smuggle. Inside, the numbers went where siege numbers go. The Chronicle preserves one price, and it's enough: a single measure of bran selling for 30 denarii. Coarse husks normally shoveled to animals, priced like luxury goods in the city of the apostles. Behind a statistic like that stands everything it implies. The old and the small dying first, as they always do, in a city already half graveyard. Benedict, to his credit, stood on the walls during that siege too, but with words, preaching to the defenders and hurling excommunications down at the besiegers, the only weapons he owned. The comparison to the last man on those ramparts sets itself up. John in a cuirass with a sword, Benedict in a stole with a sentence of anathema. Rome held for about a month. On the 23rd of June, 964, the gates opened, and the Romans, in the phrase that has stuck to this episode ever since, handed their pope over, walked Benedict the grammarian out to the emperor's lines, and gave him up to save themselves. What Otto and Leo did with him was staged as carefully as any scene in this whole saga, and it's among the most quietly brutal things in it, precisely because nobody bleeds. A synod convened in the Lateran, John's old house, with the emperor enthroned and Leo XIII presiding, and Benedict was brought in wearing the full papal vestments and carrying the ferula, the pastoral staff of the Roman bishop. They asked him by what right he had dared, and Benedict, no soldier, no liar, answered, in effect, that he had done wrong, and cast himself on their mercy. He was made to lie prostrate on the floor. Then Leo tore the pallium from his shoulders, the band of white wool, the badge of the office itself, ripped off the man's body, and took the ferula from his hand and broke it over him, snapped the staff of St. Peter across the prostrate body of the man Rome had chosen, so the crack of the wood would say what no decree could. They degraded him from the papacy, stripped him past priesthood down to simple deacon, and Otto, who seems to have developed something like respect for this gentle, ruined man, took him north as a prisoner and lodged him in Hamburg, at the far, cold edge of the Christian world, in the custody of its archbishop. Benedict lived out about a year there. The locals came to regard him as very nearly a saint. He died in 965 or 966, and decades later an emperor, Otto's own grandson, Otto III, had the bones brought home to Rome, an apology delivered a generation too late to the last casualty of John XII's reign. And that's the ledger of the boy pope's final year, drawn in full. One bishop flogged, a hand, some fingers, a face and a tongue, a massacre in January, a famine in June, one broken staff, and one blameless scholar dead in exile for the crime of being chosen after him. Now, since we've leaned on him all night, Liutprand has earned his own send-off. The afterlife of this story is really the afterlife of one man's prose. Our chronicler did fine out of the new order, Bishop of Cremona, imperial diplomat, the emperor's pen, right up until Otto sent him to Constantinople in 968 to arrange a Byzantine marriage, and the Byzantine emperor Nikephoros spent months humiliating him. Bad lodgings, worse food, lectures about how the Franks were unwashed barbarians and Otto no true emperor at all. Liutprand went home and wrote a report so vicious it's still assigned in universities for pure entertainment, and then he died, probably in 972, leaving behind the 3 books that fixed this entire era in Europe's memory. And fix it they did. When the Reformation came, Protestant writers found in Liutprand's pages everything they needed. A papacy of murderers and mistresses, documented by a bishop, and they built the word pornocracy on the foundation he laid. The Catholic answer came from Cardinal Baronius around 1600, and what's striking is that Baronius, the Church's own official historian, didn't really dispute the portrait. He's the one who named it the Dark Age, the Seculum Obscurum, and he wrote about these popes with open disgust, taking the position that the survival of the papacy through such men proved God's protection of the office, since no merely human institution could have lived through its own leadership. That has to rank among the most backhanded defenses ever mounted, and also, you have to admit, a fair point. Then Gibbon arrived in the 1700s and carved the whole thing into the marble of English prose, and John XII became permanently what he remains in every list and every countdown: the worst, or nearly the worst, Pope of them all. Modern historians pick at the portrait, as they should. Every brushstroke of it comes from the winners. The trial was a political necessity dressed as a moral one, and Liutprand demonstrably shaped his material for effect, right down to choosing monster from the old poets. Strip the case to what multiple independent lines actually support, and you keep this much beyond serious argument. He took the office as a teenager through a rigged oath. He ran it as a secular prince. He betrayed the emperor he crowned in writing to pagans among others. He fled with the treasury. He came back and mutilated churchmen, and he died young, fast and unabsolved, in circumstances his own city found no trouble believing. The dice prayers, the devil's toast, the full census of the women, those live in sworn testimony. You can weigh however your conscience weighs oaths given in front of occupying armies. He is, in the end, exactly what his trial made him: a man you can only know through the men who destroyed him. Some people find that reasonable doubt. Others point out that nobody in 1,000 years has found a single source that liked him. Before we follow the wreckage forward, the strangest gap in the whole file needs filling: the man himself. Strip away the trial record, and what survives of John XII in his own voice is startlingly ordinary. His chancery functioned. Bulls went out over his name for 8 years, privileges for monasteries, confirmations for bishops, pallia granted to archbishops as far away as Germany and beyond. Churchmen across Europe wrote to Rome and received correct, formulaic answers sealed with his seal. Cluny, the great engine of monastic reform, the conscience of the age, received favors from him and had no recorded complaint. So did Subiaco, the mountain sanctuary where Saint Benedict himself had lived in his cave 4 centuries earlier, the cradle of Western monasticism, confirmed in its lands and rights by a bull carrying this pope's name, the holiest address in Italy accepting parchment from the Lateran without blinking. Judge him by the paperwork alone, and the reign looks like any other: a functioning administration under a pope nobody would remember. That gap is the vertigo of studying him. On one shelf, a bureaucracy issuing parchment, on the other, sworn testimony about the devil's health being toasted down the hall. Both shelves are real documents. Nobody has ever fully reconciled them, and the honest position is that nobody can. The private man is simply gone, and what stands in his place is the version his destroyers needed, and the version his clerks typed up, with a human being somewhere unrecoverable between them. One transaction from those files puts an actual saint in the room with him. In the autumn of 960, an Englishman arrived in Rome. Dunstan, the newly appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, Abbot of Glastonbury, reformer, kingmaker, the towering churchman of Anglo-Saxon England, and a future saint on both the Catholic and Orthodox calendars. He had crossed the Channel and walked the whole pilgrim road to collect his pallium, the narrow band of white lamb's wool, without which an archbishop's authority stayed theoretical. Custom surrounded the object with tenderness. The wool came from lambs blessed on St. Agnes's feast, was woven by nuns, and lay overnight on the tomb of Peter itself before it ever touched a man's shoulders. His biographer preserves a detail from that journey. Dunstan gave away so much to the poor along the route that his own party ran out of provisions, and when his exasperated steward pointed this out, the archbishop answered, in effect, that Christ would see to dinner, and, the biographer insists, dinner duly appeared. This is who came climbing the steps of St. Peter's on the 21st of September 960. And the Pope who laid the pallium across his shoulders at the Apostles' tomb with all the ancient formulas was our John, 22 or 23 years old, 3 years out from his trial, presiding correctly and by all appearances gravely over one of the most solemn rites his office performs. Dunstan took the wool, went home, spent the next quarter century rebuilding the English church into something rigorous and holy, and never, in any surviving text, said one word against the young man who gave it to him. Maybe he saw nothing during his stay. Maybe he saw plenty and understood the wool was blessed by Peter, whatever hands passed it over. Either way, the scene stands on record, one of the great saints of the century kneeling before its alleged monster, and the machinery of the church humming along above them both, stamping documents, dispensing grace, asking nothing. We don't even have his face. A portrait from life was never made, as far as anyone knows, and the chronicles skip his person entirely. Height, coloring, all of it, blank. The mosaic medallion you'll find if you search his name, part of the long frieze of papal portraits in St. Paul's outside the walls, was invented centuries later by artists working down a list, a generic young man's face filled in where a real one should be. For a figure this notorious, the physical blankness is almost eerie. Every teller of this story, me included, is describing a silhouette and trusting the paperwork around it. His family, though, his family we can follow, and the sequel is where this story stops being about one bad man and starts being about a machine. Because the house of Theophylact was not finished with the papacy, not remotely. After a few decades on the back foot, the clan, now styled the Counts of Tusculum, from their fortress town in the hills southeast of Rome, came roaring back, and in 1012 they simply resumed the family business, as if the Ottonian interruption had been a bad dream. A Tusculan count's son became Pope Benedict VIII, a capable one actually, a fighting pope in the family tradition who won actual battles. When he died, his brother took the throne as John XIX, and here the mask slips entirely. This brother was a layman, the civil governor of Rome, and he went from unordained aristocrat to pope in a single day. The same one-day sprint through holy orders that everyone had howled about with Leo VIII, now performed in-house, for convenience, without an emperor even asking. And when he died, the family reached one branch further down and produced the heir to end all heirs. In 1032, the Counts of Tusculum installed Theophylactus, son of Count Alberic III. Note the names still cycling, Theophylact, Alberic, a century deep, as Pope Benedict IX. He was, depending on the source you trust, anywhere from about 12 to 20 years old. And here he is at last. John's only serious rival for youngest pope in history, great-great-nephew territory on the same family tree, the final name in Gibbon's rare genealogy. and Benedict IX proceeded to have a career that makes even John look like a man of settled habits. The chronicles charge him with the full inherited inventory, the violence, the seized women. One later pope described his life as so foul it shuddered to describe it, and then he added innovations. He was driven out of Rome by revolts and fought his way back. He was deposed and returned, and in 1044 to 1045, in the family's crowning transaction, he sold the papacy. Sold it, negotiated a price, allegedly against the income of church lands, or so he could pursue a marriage, and transferred the office of St. Peter to his own godfather for money, then later changed his mind and tried to repossess it, so that at one point in 1046, 3 separate men all claimed to be pope simultaneously, one of them a Tusculan on his 3rd attempt. The dynasty that had made a 17-year-old pope by deathbed oath in 955 ended by making the papacy itself a resale item. John wasn't an aberration in that house. He was a first draft. Cleaning up the 3 popes fiasco fell, in the end, to a German king marching south to sort out Rome, and if that sentence gives you an odd sense of the century folding back on itself, it should. This is John XII's most durable legacy, working exactly as designed. The arrangement he sealed in February 962, a Roman crown on a German head, and that quiet clause obliging popes to swear loyalty to the emperor, did not die with him or with Otto. It ran for 100 years. Otto's son and grandson made and unmade popes. In 1046, King Henry III arrived at the Synod of Sutri, swept all 3 competing pontiffs off the board in a matter of days, and simply appointed a German bishop, then another, then another. A run of imperial popes handed down from north of the Alps, one of whom, Leo IX, turned out to be the spark of the great reform movement that would eventually clean house. Follow the chain and it bends into irony so neat you'd reject it in fiction. The reformers, raised under imperial protection, eventually turned on imperial control itself, and by the time Gregory VII was making an emperor stand barefoot in the snow at Canossa in 1077, the papacy had reversed the entire relationship John signed into being. Every link of that chain hangs off the crown a compromised 24-year-old set on Otto's head to save his own skin. He built, in one winter, both the cage his successors lived in and, at several removes, the force that broke it. Not bad for a man remembered exclusively for dice and mistresses. His other legacy you've already heard tonight without noticing. Every single time I said his name. John XII. He was the 12th John, and the name-changing custom he cemented turned papal names into a running historical ledger. And the ledger of John's, specifically, became the most haunted in the church. The numbering after him got so tangled by medieval clerical errors that a phantom slipped in. There has never been a Pope John XX. The sequence just skips him, because scribes miscounted the earlier Johns, partly thanks to the chaos of this very era, and the mistake fossilized. Every John since has carried a number that is quietly, permanently wrong by one, and the Church long ago decided that correcting it would cause more confusion than living with it. So the error our man's century helped create is now built into the furniture of the institution, printed on documents and carved on tombs, forever. Then a disgraced anti-pope took the name John XXIII in the early 1400s, and after that, popes avoided the name entirely. For over 500 years, no pope would touch it, the most common papal name in history, radioactive, in real part because of the trail our man and his relatives left on it. It took until 1958 for a pope to reclaim it, when the fat, beloved grandfatherly Angelo Roncalli deliberately chose John XXIII, remarking on the long line of Johns before him with their mostly brief pontificates, and set about scrubbing the name clean. Successfully, since that John is now a canonized saint and the one most people think of first. Somewhere well down the list he redeemed, past the saint and the phantom and the anti-pope, sits a teenager from the Via Lata who threw dice in the Lateran. Rome itself, meanwhile, barely broke stride after burying him, and the immediate sequel shows the machine grinding on without its most famous operator. After Benedict the Grammarian was carted off north and Leo VIII died quietly in 965, the next pope, John XIII, elected with Otto's blessing, naturally under the new rules, lasted 10 weeks before the Roman nobility rose, grabbed him, roughed him up, and threw him into Castel Sant'Angelo, the family fortress, the same walls that had held Marozia and smothered John X. He escaped. Otto came back down the peninsula one more time, and the reprisals that followed were fully in period. The city prefect who'd led the rising was hanged by his hair from the equestrian statue, then thought to be Constantine, paraded backwards on a donkey, and exiled. 12 militia captains were hanged, others were blinded. All of that within 3 years of our John's death, under the reformed, imperially supervised system that had been installed specifically to end this sort of thing. If you've been wondering whether the whole catastrophe of 963 to 964 actually changed Rome, the answer sits right there. The names rotated, the statue got a new decoration, and the Tiber kept moving. The other players from John's last gamble get their curtain calls here, and fate handed them out with a bleak evenness. Berengar II, the land-grabbing king whose raids started the whole chain, the man John begged Otto to destroy, was starved out of his final fortress at San Leo around the same weeks John was being deposed a day's ride away. The emperor shipped him and his queen, Willa, over the Alps into captivity at Bamberg, deep in Germany, where the sometime king of Italy died a prisoner in 966, and Willa finished her days in a convent. Willa was Liutprand's other great villainess. The same pen that ruined Theodora and Marozia spends chapters smearing her with identical relish, charge after charge of cruelty and sorcery, and setting those portraits side by side teaches you at least as much about the author as about any of the women. Adalbert, the fugitive prince John embraced on the walls, the alliance he burned an emperor for, fought on after his ally died, out of Corsica, with Byzantine money whispering behind him, until Otto's Swabian troops broke his last army near the Po in 965. He ran again, for good this time, and died in exile in Burgundy years later, a king's son who spent his entire adult life running. Even Pandulf Ironhead, the Lombard prince who handed young John his first defeat back in the 950s, sailed on serenely. He ended up ruling most of southern Italy as Otto's trusted ally and died a ruler in 981, having outlasted everyone who ever fought him. And Otto kept everything. 9 more years of empire, a Byzantine princess finally secured for his heir, the whole structure settling into the permanence it would hold for centuries, and then a peaceful death in 973 after Vespers in his own bed, followed by burial in his own cathedral at Magdeburg. The archbishopric that exists because a frightened young pope co-signed it 11 days into a friendship that destroyed him. Every man from that coronation morning ended where the odds always pointed. The 50-year-old professional died full of years in his own church. The others died in prison, in exile, or in someone else's bed. The ledger of this reign has a page that almost never gets counted, and it belongs to the women. Run back through the names the record preserves. Stephana, the dead prince's concubine, passed from father to son like the palace furniture, and think about her actual position for a second. A woman whose safety in Rome depended entirely on the favor of Alberic's household, presented with the desires of Alberic's heir, who was also her sovereign and also the Pope. What refusal was available to her? The record charges him with adultery and lets her stand in the file as a temptation with a name. Rhaenyra, the widow with the chalices and the cities. The sources sneer at her as a kept woman grown rich, and never once ask what a widow in 10th century Rome, alone in that city, was supposed to do when the master of it turned his attention on her. Anna, widowed too. Anna's niece, a girl whose age nobody bothered to write down, remembered by history for one fact only. The wife of Rhaenyra, in whose bed a pope died, whose name we don't even have, and whose life after the 14th of May, 964, married to a man the whole city now knew, in a Rome that blamed women first as a reflex. The record closes on without a word. And behind the named ones, the crowd the testimony gestures at, the women of the palace, the pilgrims warned off the apostles' tomb, wives and daughters in a city where the ruler's appetite was law and the ruler was 19. Every man in this story got a trial, a synod, a chronicle, an argument that has lasted 1,000 years. The women got a sentence each, if that, written by their enemies, and then the file closes. Liutprand claims the women of Rome rallied to bring John back in 964, and maybe some did. Power, protection, and survival braid together in ways a hostile bishop wouldn't bother untangling. The truth of any of their lives is past recovering. What's certain is that the era got named after them, the rule of the harlots, while the hands doing the ruling, the strangling, the blinding and the bargaining belonged, with 2 formidable exceptions, to men. And the boy himself, the person visible around the edges of the transcript, look at what he actually grew up inside. His grandmother had allegedly arranged the smothering of a pope and was rotting, as he learned to walk, in a cell his father put her in. His uncle had worn the tiara as a household servant and died young and silenced. His father, the one strong figure in his life, had taken the city with a mob at 18, ruled it by fear and competence for 2 decades. And then, dying, reached out from the bed and bent the next papal election around his son like iron. Octavian was never asked whether he wanted to be pope. He was sworn into it by other men over a tomb before the vacancy even existed. He came to supreme spiritual office with a soldier's education, a prince's appetites, an emperor's name, and, this is the part I find genuinely bleak, apparently not one person left alive with both the standing and the courage to tell him no. His father was dead. His confessor tried, if the blinding charge holds, and you heard how that ended. Otto tried from a distance with fatherly letters and got betrayal for it. Absolute power over a city, spiritual authority over a continent, at an age when most men were still being cuffed by their fathers. Very few human beings in history have been handed that combination, and the ones who were rarely came out of it well at 50, let alone at 18. None of that acquits a man of a blinded confessor, a gelded cardinal, a scourged bishop, and a trail of women who couldn't say no to him either. It just puts the tragedy where it belongs, not only in what he did, but in the fact that everyone who built his life, from Theophylact down to Alberic's deathbed, made this outcome about as close to certain as human arrangements get. And then the chroniclers acted surprised. Even his exile has a strange, sour vividness. The winter of 963 found him on the terraces above Tivoli, a deposed pope in his mid-20s, the fugitive Prince Adalbert beside him, a baggage train carrying the accumulated gold of the Roman Church, and around them whatever hired swords and loyal hangers-on the money could hold together in the cold. Down on the plain, visible on a clear day, the city that had sworn him out. Messengers riding up with council summonses, the young man taking his bow into the hills instead. Meanwhile, his agents slipped in and out of Rome with purses, buying the ground back family by family, the way his people had always worked. Whatever else the man was, nobody could call him passive. And even the historian who ranks him among the worst popes who ever lived adds in the same breath that he was no dummy. He outweighted an emperor, flipped a city with cash and connections in 10 weeks, and reversed his own deposition with a synod staffed by his judges. Alberic would have recognized every move. It's the one stretch of his life where you can watch the father's training run clean. And it bought him exactly 3 months. His reputation, once he was gone, only ever moved one direction, and the accumulation across the centuries has its own dark comedy. Medieval chroniclers copied Liutprand and added varnish. The Reformation weaponized him. Baronius disowned him on the church's own behalf. Gibbon immortalized him. By the 20th century, when the popular historian E.R. Chamberlain sat down to write a book called The Bad Popes, John got pride of place. First chapter, the standard against whom the Borgias themselves get measured. And John Julius Norwich, surveying every pontiff from Peter onward for his big history of the papacy, reached our man and settled the matter with 2 words that became a fixture. The unspeakable, John XII. Unspeakable, from a historian who had just cheerfully spent chapters speaking about murderers and found this one deserving of a category upgrade. Meanwhile, whenever anyone anywhere compiles a worst popes list, and the internet compiles them weekly, he's there, usually at or near the top, in permanent rotation with his own great-great-nephew Benedict and a couple of Renaissance colleagues. 1100 years of consistent reviews. The one mercy is that he isn't alone up there. The discomfort for the institution is how many of the names around him share his last name, so to speak. And the modern attention has its own odd shape. The Borgias, his nearest rivals in infamy, at least built palaces, patronized artists, and schemed on a continental scale, and history grants them a certain dark glamour for it. John's file offers nothing to glamorize. 8 years of appetite followed by a trial transcript. And maybe the very bareness of it explains why the 10th century teenager still outranks the Renaissance professionals whenever the worst of the office gets tallied. A Borgia gives you intrigue to admire against your will. John gives you a blinded old confessor and a starving city. And admiration has nowhere to land. He does still hold one contested record, youngest pope ever. It comes down to him versus Benedict IX, and it hinges entirely on those two disputed mothers a century apart. If Octavian was Alda's son, born 937, he took the throne at 17 or 18, and the crown is his. If he was the concubine's boy from 930, he was a comparatively seasoned 25, and Benedict, himself anywhere from 12 to 20 at election, on equally slippery evidence, likely takes it. Two members of one family, holding between them both ends of an unanswerable question, with every other pope in history locked out of the running. For scale, the next youngest serious contender, Gregory V in the 990s, was about 24 and counts as a shocking prodigy. The Tusculans didn't just lower the bar, they own the bar permanently, because after the reforms of the 11th century, the Church made structurally sure nobody could ever approach it. Minimum ages, conclave rules, the whole apparatus of the modern election exists, in real measure, as scar tissue over this exact family. One more surprise sits in the official record. The Church never unpoped him. Open the Vatican's own annual directory today, the Annuario Pontificio, and he's right there on the list of legitimate popes, in sequence, reign dated 955 to 964, printed exactly like the saints on either side of him in the column. The list gives him no asterisk of shame, and no formal posthumous condemnation was ever pronounced over him. In the Church's own final accounting, the December Synod's sentence never stuck, and it's his rival Leo VIII who wears the footnote. The directory carries an openly hedged note about Leo, conceding in as many words that if his election was invalid, then Benedict V was the true pope. An official shrug, republished annually for over a century now, about a question this one man's reign created 1,000 years ago. And everything John did as pope stands. Otto's imperial crown was never voided, so the Holy Roman Empire's entire legal existence ran back through those particular anointed hands until the whole edifice folded in 1806. Magdeburg stands. Dunstan's pallium stood. The priests and bishops he ordained outside the contested batches stayed ordained and went on ordaining others. The theology carrying all of that has a Latin tag, ex opere operato. The sacrament works by the work performed, meaning the rite itself delivers the grace, and the personal state of the minister, however foul, cannot poison it. The Church had hammered out that principle centuries earlier against rigorists who wanted sinful clergy's sacraments voided. And the 10th century proceeded to load test it like nothing before or since. Its plain implication remains one of the stranger sentences you can write about Christianity. A man could toast the devil at night and validly bind heaven in the morning, and the system was engineered deliberately to survive exactly that. Believers see in this the entire point. Treasure in earthen vessels, the office greater than any hand that holds it. Skeptics see an institution insulated from its own leadership by design. The career we've just walked through supplies full supporting evidence to both, and I'd only observe that no other man ever made the doctrine work so hard. One last thread, and then I'll let him rest. You can't visit him. The Lateran received his body in May 964 into the ancient Basilica of Constantine, the actual 4th century building, by then already 600 years old, its floor and crypts stacked with popes. That building is gone. On the 6th of May, 1308, fire took the Lateran. Roof, timbers, treasures, the accumulated furniture of 1,000 years. And what the first fire spared, a second finished in 1361. The basilica standing there today, the one tourists walk through beneath the colossal marble apostles, is a rebuild over the bones of the site, and in the burning and clearing and reconstruction, the tombs of a whole stretch of early medieval popes were destroyed or scattered or simply lost track of. John's among them. The tomb is gone. If an epitaph existed, the fires took every record of it. He left neither relic nor shrine, for obvious reasons. No one was ever going to pray at that grave. The most infamous pope of the first millennium has, as his sole surviving monument, a stack of parchment, the minutes of his own trial, taken down by the man who called him a monster, and one short letter in bad Latin, preserved because his enemies found it too useful to burn. Somewhere under the floor of the rebuilt Lateran, or in the fill beneath it, whatever was left of him after 1308 is part of the foundation now. The palace he was accused of disgracing is, in the most literal sense, standing on him. And that's the story. Thanks for spending the evening with me and a genuinely terrible man. If you stuck it out to the end, you're exactly why I make these long ones. If the video kept you company on a commute, a night shift, or while falling asleep, a like and a subscribe honestly go further than you'd think. Tell me in the comments who you want covered next. The more doomed the better, apparently, going by last time. Huge thank you, as always, to the Patreon supporters and YouTube members holding this channel up. Every link to join them is in the description and the pinned comment. Sleep well. I'll see you in the next one.